Hello everybody, my name is Jimmy Smith and welcome to another Grape Varieties on Viognier. This is our advanced version and this is ideal for those of you studying WSET, Level 3 and Level 4. If you require a slightly easier version, we do have an intermediate version which is ideal for WSET Level 2. So, just a few things. My Twitter and Instagram handle is @WineWithJimmy. If you require any comments or questions, please get in touch and you'll see my Instagram feed with lots of wine information and wine pictures. Then we have my two wine schools that I own, @West London Wine and @South London Wine, both in London and United Kingdom. And then I've also got a really cool little wine bar called Streatham Wine House down in Streatham in South London. So if you are in London, please come and see us for a class or a glass. And all the websites are at the bottom. So let's look at a little bit about the history of Viognier. We'll look about what it's like in the vineyard, in the winery, where we find it, and then what it tastes like. So Viognier's history is that it was mentioned first right at the end of the 18th century in the Northern Rhone. It was actually mentioned in a document which said that there are two grape varieties from around Ampuis and Vienne, which are Serine and Viognier. So that's Syrah and Viognier of note. So we know that we have some pretty old documentation of it, therefore, at the end of the 18th century. Now, we know that it has a genetic link to Mondeuse Blanche. Mondeuse Blanche is a variety from Savoie. Today, very little of it, but the black version of it, Mondeuse Noire, is quite significant today, and in fact the leading black variety in that region. So it is a parent or offspring relationship with this variety. Basically, that means that we know it is Eastern French, so it's found somewhere down around the Alps and down towards the Massif Central, that kind of all southern sort of central southeastern zone. And that's also the link to Syrah as well. So there you are. So it's the half sibling or grandparent of Syrah, as we don't know the other. But therefore, of course, will be found where we find Syrah. It's been moved through time, through history, with that grape variety. And of course, we know that's quite important because, in fact, Côte Rôtie, which allows the blend of these two, is in the Northern Rhone. It actually, and this is one that was about 10, 15 years ago, we actually have some good genetics now about the fact that it has quite a close genetic kinship to Friese. And Friese is a variety from around Alba. So there's quite a bit of it produced around Alba, Asti sort of zone. And it's very close genetically, Friese, to Nebbiolo. They say it's kind of like a 70-75% close genetic kinship. So therefore, Viognier has some tenuous link to Nebbiolo. So that's rather interesting about its heritage. Now, interestingly, Viognier has had a difficult past. It is a variety which we don't know a huge amount about because of the pure fact of its difficulty to cultivate. Really, farmers in medieval days and going into sort of early modern era would in fact look for varieties which were capable cultivars, were easy to grow and easy to produce from. Viognier is none of that. It is a difficult, low-yielding vine which can actually dramatically drop in yields due to climatic and weather patterns. So, come to the 1960s, there was a very limited amount of this available, only around 14 hectares in France. And really from the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, there was very little in the world. But that number has increased. And that number has increased due to more New World phenomenon, more New World marketing, as Viognier has been planted in Australia, co-planted with Syrah, and producing Syrah Viognier wines, Shiraz Viognier wines in Australia. And in fact, they have been made quite popular. So therefore, this popularism of the grape Viognier has led to a bit of its rebirth. In fact, it's quite fashionable now today. So somewhere like Condrieu, for instance, which only had around 6 or 7 hectares under vine in the 1960s, today has about 160 odd hectares under vine. So it certainly has grown from almost obscurity to something of a little bit of substance within its home area. So really that's its history. As I mentioned today, there is more of it available. Countries around the world are starting to focus on it. We've certainly got stuff from, there's productions in places like California, Virginia, in eastern and southern states has a bit, Washington State, New Zealand, Argentina, South Africa, Australia. There's Viognier now found across the world, not in any great volume, but it is certainly found across the world today. So it's had its rebirth in the last sort of 20 to 30 years. Viognier in the vineyard likes a kind of moderate climate usually, but can go up to warm climates, of course, in places like the New World. It is a grape that ripens very well and gains a lot of sugar. So as a variety, it is an early budder, so it can suffer with spring frosts, and it's kind of mid-ish ripening. So it has a fairly long growing season. The issue with Viognier is it does tend to reduce in acidities very quickly towards the end of its season, which means that your resultant style is quite a full-bodied wine, often lacking in its acids. Another thing that's quite important is that Viognier, really from its home country of France, is cultivated in 2 major styles: complex Northern Rhone styles, and then often more simpler, fresher Languedoc Southern French wine styles. And this is quite often attributed to volume from the age of the vines. Normally, you are looking at vine age around 30 years plus in the Northern Rhone, not always, but often, producing wines of much more density, weight, and complexity. Some of them can be in excess of 70 years old. Down in the southern France, though, they do tend to push out a lot of replantation for younger vines, and often sort of 15, 20-year-old vines are quite productive, making slightly simpler, lightly aromatic, but simpler Viogniers, not the kind of unctuous, flamboyant style that we're used to from the Northern Rhone. It's, as I mentioned before, through history, it was so dwindling because of its yielding. It's such a low yielder. And there's a number of reasons for this, and I think we go into them here. We will do in a second, but it is a low yielder due to really things like shedding its blossom. So wind factor can be a bit of an issue. But generally speaking, it is just a low yielding variety. Anyway, compact bunches, quite thick skin, quite resistant to rot, so that's not too much of an issue. But those thick-skinned grapes do have quite a bit of flavor compound to them. So when the wine is pressed, if there is any skin contact, this is where you get a lot of quite intense floral flavor characteristics. Like I mentioned, it's very susceptible to wind damage, and this is couleur. It does shed its blossom during flowering and leading up to flowering quite easy, which will dramatically reduce yields. And in areas where we find it, in France, say, it is an area which is dramatically affected by the Mistral wind, which of course will reduce these yields. You will find that the vines will often be trellised and staked, often with something called the échalasse system, which is like a teepee structure to protect it and give it support, but also to try and offer some sort of shading so the flowers are not so ripped away and losing your yield. It is also susceptible to water stress, so in warmer climates like New World zones, there does need to be an access to water, and this can also dramatically reduce yield. And the resultant style is a wine, or a grape rather, which is very high in sugar but quite low in acid. Another reason why it's not the world's most popular wine style is this combination: full-bodied alcoholic white wines with lacking acidity, which means a lack of freshness. And most people today want fresher style wines. Viognier needs to be fully ripe to actually unleash its flavor profile and flavor compounds, which we'll talk about later. And this needs to be by restricting yields. This could be by climatic and weather patterns, but also by human interference as well. So you need to get fully ripe grapes, unless they can come across a little bit green and lacking in flavor. Viognier is often found on its own, but because of its ability of unctuous texture and roundness and ripe fruit and floral compounds, it is also used as blending, and it adds a lot of aromatics to a blend. So you may see it in the south of France blended with things like Chardonnay, for instance, but you may see it blended with things like Grenache and Marsanne, as it's found in the whites of Côte de Rhone and Côte de Rhone Village. So you will see this, and lots of IGP wine use Viognier as well in their blend. So blending is common. But also, not just with white varieties, we do traditionally see it co-planted in the Rhone Valley with Syrah and harvested with Syrah and then fermented, co-fermented with the grape as well. So you will find up to 20% in Côte Rôtie, often nowhere near that number, but certainly some producers will add up to 5% just to add a little bit more aromatics and slightly tame Syrah's quite hard rustic edge. Of course, with the lack of acidity, they really try to protect the malic acid, which is a fresher component of the acids. So malolactic conversion or fermentation will be avoided for obvious reasons to protect those acids. Lees is used. You will find that even more textural wines can be produced in areas like Condrieu by having some amount of lees aging. So élevage sur lie will be found. And a lot of Viognier is in fact stainless steel today, certainly from the Languedoc and the south of France. And also Côte de Rhone, but Old Oak you will find as well, certainly for the more powerful Northern Rhone Viogniers from Condrieu. New Oak is becoming increasingly more popular, but it still is Old Oak which is the major style. And sometimes, certainly in its most famous appellation, which is Condrieu, you may find some residual sugars in the wine. So the sugars, of course, build up quite exponentially with Viognier, and they're not always fully fermented. So this may be a small amount of sugar, and in some cases quite high amounts of sugar, making a sweeter wine. You can get sweet versions of Condrieu, for instance. So there can be some residual sugars from the Northern Rhone. Its key locations, so just this one slide for this grape variety, about 4,500 hectares under vine in France, which is a lot from 14 hectares about 50 to 60 years ago. The major AOC is Condrieu. Within that is in fact a chateau that has its own AOC, which is Chateau Crier, and that's a sort of a 6 or 7 hectare estate with its own AOC. It is on the map. Côte Rôtie, we find it, of course, used in blending with Syrah. And then in the Southern Rhone, or mainly in the Southern Rhone, the Côte de Rhone, the Côte de Rhone Village, and Languedoc and IGP wines, all those kind of areas. Generally simpler, but adding aromatics to blends down there. Australia has about the same amount, often blended with Shiraz, but you may find some varietals as well. California, often blended, some blendings with Chenin Blanc, for instance. South Africa, an increasing amount of production around the Swartland, in areas like Tulbagh mountain vineyards, Eden Sabi, good productions around Swartland, Tulbagh, Wellington, those kind of areas, and even a little bit in Elgin actually is produced as well. And Argentina, Mendoza and San Juan has a significant production as well. But really, in total, the numbers are not massive with this grape variety. And lots of things to talk about. Because it's ripe in sugar and full on flavor and aromas, there's lots of things. So you'll see the kind of top part of the picture here. You'll find things like jasmine, you'll find things like rose, perfume, violet, geranium characteristics, loads of different floral compounds to be found. But then fruits like mandarin, like peach, like nectarine, like pear, like melon are quite common. And then maybe even some spices, cloves, cinnamon, vanilla, and a little bit of oak can be found depending on the new oak as well. They are very vibrant, very sweet fruits, tropical stone fruit bridge with a lot of floral compounds behind them. So quite intensive wines, certainly for the higher end quality ones. Acids are, of course, quite low, but can be up to medium sometimes, depending on the production. Full-bodied, fairly high alcohols as well, moderate to high alcohols are quite classic. So that's the Grape Variety Viognier for advanced, and that is ideal for WSET Level 3 and Level 4. My name's Jimmy Smith, at Wine with Jimmy on Instagram and Twitter. And please look out for my wine schools, West London Wine School, South London Wine School, and my wine bar, Streatham Wine House. Once again, if you're in London, please come for a class or a glass. Please get in contact with any of our websites at the bottom. But thank you very much. I hope you've learned something, and see you again soon.